It's of my privilege to be moderating this panel consisting of 2 Russian participants and 3 Americans. And I think the last time we had an engagement of that sort, we had the Saudis sitting in the middle. But you'd have to do without them this time, for that turns out to be my job. We are also, this is happening at a slightly awkward time. Around in the next couple of hours, we will have a phone call between President Putin of Russia and President Trump of the United States. And so it's quite possible that this conversation that we'll be having may be overtaken by events in the next few hours. But what we'll try and do is focus a little bit on some of the longer term trends. And I'm going to start, you have the speakers' biographies in front of you. I won't repeat this. I'm going to start off by turning to Dr. Paul Saunders with the Center for National Interest. And maybe start off by just telling our audience a little bit what has been the nature of the Trump administration's outreach to Moscow, and what, as you see it, is President Trump's intent.
Thank you, Dhruva, and thank you to the ORF for the invitation to be here. It's really a spectacular event. So I'll start perhaps by pointing out that President Trump has been talking about trying to find a settlement to the war in Ukraine really for quite some time, certainly well before the election in the United States. Some may recall during the campaign that he promised to settle the conflict quite quickly. And we saw really fairly early on, and also during the campaign, the broad outlines of a strategy emerge. That strategy had 2 basic components. On one hand, to use Ukraine's reliance on the United States for military and other support as a point of leverage to bring Ukraine to the negotiating table. And on the other hand, to use the threat of additional support for Ukraine or additional sanctions or other actions to put pressure on Russia to try to bring Russia to the negotiating table. So this idea of trying to settle the conflict and this broad approach has really been out there for quite some time. Certainly when President Trump was elected, he moved relatively quickly to appoint a special envoy, former Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, to work on this issue. Mr. Kellogg has had a number of meetings with the Ukrainian side and also with America's allies in Europe. In parallel with that, there has been a separate process, which many have seen, of outreach to Russia. Dhruva mentioned the meeting in Saudi Arabia a few weeks ago between the U.S. Secretary of State and National Security Advisor and the American Special Envoy to the President's Special Envoy for the Middle East, Mr. Witkoff, with a Russian delegation, including the foreign minister, the foreign policy advisor to Russia's president, and also the head of the Russian government investment fund. U.S. officials have been certainly speaking off and on to their Russian counterparts over the course of the last few weeks. Mr. Witkoff, of course, went to Moscow recently to continue those discussions. And that's just very briefly, very quickly, what has led up to this phone call that we'll have tonight that will be at least an initial focal point for the direct U.S.-Russian interaction. Now, where President Trump's intent is concerned, I think the president actually has been quite clear that his intent is to find a peaceful settlement to the conflict. He's referred to the war many times as a senseless war. And I think that fairly clearly conveys his motives and his intent in bringing an end to the conflict. We also certainly hear him very frequently talking about the lives lost and the destruction that's resulted from the conflict. I don't want to step too much on the territory of the other panelists, but I might just leave with one parting thought, which is that while President Trump has referred to it as a senseless conflict, it's less apparent that the Russian leadership or the Ukrainian leadership view it as a senseless conflict. And they certainly each have their own reasons for fighting, which, on the Russian side, I think the Russian leadership, President Putin, has been fairly open about his motives and goals in waging the war. And on the Ukrainian side, I think it's also quite apparent why the Ukrainian government would want to defend its territory. And that certainly, this incomplete alignment, shall we say, among how the leaders view the conflict, I think is certainly something we'll have to watch moving forward.
Thank you so much. That's a nice segue to Mr. Nikonov. How does Moscow view Trump's overtures? And if I can put it rather bluntly, can Putin trust Trump?
Thank you. First of all, I'd also like to thank our friends from the ORF for this great conference. Being a veteran of this movement, I attended, I think, most of the conference, including the first one. I can congratulate you with the scope of events happening here, with great analysis and of broadening and deepening the Raisina process. ORF people attended many conferences on Valdai with President Putin, and then may well remember that during one of those conferences, he was asked the question, what was your major foreign policy mistake? And the answer was, we trusted the West. So that's my answer to a question about trust of Trump. Putin doesn't trust the West. Almost every single arms control agreement signed by the American, the United and Russia, and then the Soviet Union, was canceled by the United States. Even signed agreements are not implemented. So no trust whatsoever. At the same time, what can we expect in 2 hours? If Putin is not late, of course, as he sometimes is. Well, I think they'll have a good conversation. I'm sure that Trump, after Witkoff's visit, knows pretty well what Putin wants. Putin talked to Witkoff for 3.5 hours. So they discussed the details. So Putin will come with certain nuances, as he says, on the ceasefire. He doesn't want ceasefire in itself because what we need is lasting peace and security guarantees for Russia. America's first approach is not just of President Trump, it's also Russian approach, Russia first. And that means they'll settle certain details of the possible ceasefire. For us, I think the most important issues are the verification of ceasefire and how they going to spend those 30 days. If those 30 days of American arms supplies, I don't think that will be something Putin would support. So this is just the first step. Actually, the second step, because that is the second telephone call between the two presidents in 3 years. But it also a second telephone call between the two presidents in 2 weeks. So if you look from this perspective, it looks promising. And from my personal perspective, I'm waiting for what's going to happen in 2 ways. First, I am in the State Duma chairing the committee of something non-existent. This is a committee which is responsible for friendship with the US Congress. As you understand, there is nothing going on between the State Duma and the US Congress. Hope it will happen. If not, okay, I'll be jobless. Second thing, you know, before this Russia-Ukraine conflict, me and Dmitry Symes, who is used to be colleague of Dr. Sanders in the Center of National Interest, co-host a program on Channel 1 of Russian television. It was a weekly show. When the fighting started, we had 4 shows a day. Now we have just 3. So for me, it's a matter of how many, TV shows we'll have, and it depends on the intensity of struggle. By far, my prediction, there'll be no decline in the amount of shows, since it is in the center of Russian public opinion. It is in the center of national interest, not in literal sense of the name of the center, but in Russia's national interest. And that is something which Russians follow and where Russian public opinion has a strong say. And Putin is also in tune with the Russian public opinion. And some of the public opinion are afraid that Trump's idea is to prevent us from winning the war. And that is also one of the trends in the Russian public. So definitely people would love peace, but not at any condition. And this is what I think will happen in the next couple of hours. A sincere discussion which will lead to further little progress and further telephone calls, I get.
Thank you. If I can turn to Ambassador Mosbacher, we've heard from the previous 2 speakers what some of the limitations on this engagement could be and have been. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about what some of the critiques and limitations are, both within the United States, but also we don't have a European on this panel. If you could maybe, where does Europe factor in as you see it?
I'm not sure that critique in Europe matters, quite frankly. This isn't a discussion, this is a negotiation. And quite frankly, it reminds me of an old proverb you may or may know. Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, and all the king's men and all the king's horses couldn't put Humpty Dumpty together again. And let me put that in context for you. Bottom line here is that in 2007, President Putin gave a speech at the Munich Security Conference. If anyone had bothered to listen to it, he told all of us exactly what his grievances were and what he was going to do. And no one paid attention, including the United States. Then we watched Putin put 200,000 troops on the border of Ukraine. And again, even though all of the security services told the great Western democracies that Putin was going to invade Ukraine, we didn't pay attention, we didn't believe them. But we should have at least believed our eyes. And we did nothing. And then everyone, oh no, not gonna happen. And then Putin invaded Ukraine, and all of Europe threw their arms up and said, oh my God, he really did this? Then they stepped back and said, okay, if he does it fast, he can do it in a week. It's okay. He can have Ukraine. It's really quite simple. After all, we didn't do anything in 2014 either. So then, no one counted on the Russian army being so incompetent, and the Ukrainians being such fierce fighters. And all of a sudden, it embarrassed the great Western democracy leaders. And they were forced to do something, but do what? So they ran around, throwing up their arms and beating their chests, and said, oh my goodness, how do we do this? I mean, are we going to let our people freeze in the dark? Because we are dependent on Russian oil and gas for our energy. Then they realized that they're going to have to figure that out. Well, we'll give them some equipment, except their equipment wasn't any good because they hadn't invested in their own security. Trump's first term, I was ambassador to Poland, and I got beaten up regularly because of Trump saying, have to invest in your own security, you have to invest in 2%. And then, all of a sudden, when Putin went into Ukraine, they all realized 2%. Well, 2% doesn't make it anymore. And so they realized that, my goodness, how are we going to do this? Well, we'll have to call the United States of America because after all, they spent almost $1 trillion on their military, and they'll have the equipment, and we'll get them to help Ukraine. We will all do our part, kind of. And so then we say, well, you have to go to 5%. Well, we're damned if we do, we're damned if we don't. And at that point, the United States of America said, okay, well, Trump becomes president. He says, wait a minute, 320 million Americans gave security guarantees to 500 million Europeans so that they could invest in their countries. And those countries were built on cheap Russian oil and gas. But Trump says, wait a minute, it's time for them to step up and do their part. But they couldn't because they didn't have the equipment. They hadn't made the investment. So now they're running around, and here we are. Trump doesn't like war. He watches the death and destruction, and he wants this to be over. Now, that means he's got to negotiate this. However, the Europeans are not going to like how this comes out. But to start with my starting point of Humpty Dumpty, well, we shouldn't have let Humpty Dumpty get on that wall, Ukraine. We should have negotiated with Putin so that this war didn't start. And then to have the fantasy of thinking that Ukraine was going to win this war against Russia was also, we're watching Humpty Dumpty fall off that wall. But where are all the horses and where are all the kings to put Humpty Dumpty back together again? Well, there aren't any. So the United States step in, and hopefully this phone call today will be productive.
So,
John, yeah.
so just to clarify, and I do want to give time to the others because, so you're saying that, given all of this background and that many of us are aware of, that Europe doesn't have, looking ahead, Europe doesn't have
a say in
role to
this.
play, and Ukraine, and we have the Ukrainian foreign minister here at this conference, they are not, this is going to be a US-Russia negotiation going forward. Is that what you're?
Well, I think that's pretty obvious at this point,
Okay.
because what else does anyone have to bring to the table?
Well,
And so, to that point, yes. And certainly, we will be called arrogant, we'll be called names, but at the end of the day, we want to bring this war to an end. And to suggest that we trust Putin is also ridiculous. And to suggest that Putin isn't going to change his ways is also ridiculous. But we'll stop the war and then we'll figure out what we can work in common with Russia to bring Russia at least somewhat back into the fold. But I think we have to be realistic. And I don't think actually everyone knew the history of that. I think they knew the history, but not the reality of how this happened. And I think that's a reality check and one that needed to be said. You know, John McCain, great senator, said, Russia was nothing more than a gas station. And then Barack Obama said, well, it was maybe more than a gas station. It was a regional power. And I would suggest that they were both right, except they left one thing out. And it is a nuclear power. And that's the only reason we're here today in the place that we are with Ukraine and Russia.
Thank you. To get another Russian perspective, Professor Likacheva, where do you see, I just want our next two speakers to sort of think ahead a little bit, where do you see negotiations heading going forward? What are some of the factors that you think will shape Moscow's response going forward?
Well, thank you very much for invitation to this panel. I think it's very important. It's a very vibrant feeling where you're not just commenting history, but kind of a feeling of being into it, as most of us tonight. I wouldn't like to comment in depth about details of negotiations. First, nobody knows, and those who know, they work now. And here in this room, there are lots of brilliant diplomats who know about these tactics of negotiations, best alternatives, and all that things. But I think that there are a couple of issues that will determine these negotiations if they last at least longer than one attempt. First of all, I think there will be much less history discussions on this over these negotiations than before. Even Vladimir Putin, during his interviews with Tucker Carlson, gave lots of historical comments for 10, 15, 20 minutes. And I think it's pretty enough to go into history debates if we want to move towards the future. And as for future, demands of both sides are pretty clear. First of all, I think that for Russia, negotiation is not a goal, it's a tool. It's a tool to provide more security, if we can hope on that, but more, it's a tool to provide some deconflicting mechanisms for coming years and probably decades. No matter how these negotiations end up, even it's the world's biggest success in negotiation tactics that the world ever seen. We'll get about 1,000 kilometers of bleeding border. We have hundreds of thousands of weapons almost freely circulating over this 1,000 kilometers. We have our neighbor, Europe, that declared anti-Russian weaponization as the key uniting pillar for European integration for coming at least 6 years. So deconflicting will be on demand. If these negotiations will be able to provide these tools, it will be a big success. Second, I think regarding negotiations, the best case scenario that we can rely on is a shift from armed conflict to non-armed conflict. When we want to jump from armed conflict to peace, we skip some phases, and these illusions can lead us to some wrong directions. And as my major specialization is political economy, I can't avoid commenting on economy and economic incentives and some disputes about some possible projects that will relaunch all the impetus of US-Russia relations. I don't believe that economy in this particular case can be a game changer or a door opener for some completely new reset. However, all discussions about economy, about rare earths, It's some kind of small talk that can facilitate moves towards more sophisticated issues. If we take a look on negotiations as a deal, making an art of the deal, it's very interesting, but deal is a project. And if we speak about security and security maintained, this is always a process. Any negotiations can create beautiful conditions, but particularly process management will define the result. I'm not too optimistic about the coming phone call. I'm just very positive that this phone call can happen. It's like any talks are better than no talks. But as for strategic approaches of our side, I think the question of trust is not appropriate by this time. And even if we speak about trust building mechanisms, it's adequate from academic point of view, but it's very far from the reality we find us in. We have to speak about actions from both sides that can be easily checked and verified by the other side. Not intentions, not slogans, no mottos. Mutually checked actions that the one thing can allow us to move forward from war to non-armed conflict, and later maybe to peace. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. So, turning to our last speaker, we've heard from the previous speakers a pretty consistent line that there's a lack of trust between Moscow and Washington, that there are very different expectations, that it's a very gradual process. So, Rachel Rizzo, how could you walk us through what you see some of the possible scenarios are going forward? What are some, and of those scenarios, what are some of the more realistic outcomes that we can expect as the two leaders are about to talk to each other?
Absolutely. So I guess I'll preface this by saying something that my co-panelists have also said, which is that everything that we say here might be totally irrelevant in the next couple of hours because we don't know what this conversation with Trump and Putin is going to result in. I think it's taking place at around 8 p.m. Delhi time, so just give it a couple hours. You know, I want to start by a couple of things that have frustrated me over the last few years watching this from Washington as an American, you know, writing about this stuff from an American think tank. First is that I think Joe Biden, former President Biden, sent this message to the Ukrainians that the U.S. would support them for, quote, as long as it takes. And this was the line that was used over and over again. And there were also a lot of people pushing for Ukraine to regain its 1991 borders. And as nice as those two things would have been, I think the reality on the ground and the political situation, the political reality in the United States meant that neither of those things were going to be possible. And I think it set up unrealistic expectations and ultimately probably put Ukraine in a weaker negotiating position. These negotiations, you know, when Trump came into office, there was this talk about ending the war in 24 hours. We know that did not happen. Then it was 100 days. I don't think that will happen either. These negotiations, whatever they result in, are going to take a while. I think this is going to be a slow process. I think it's going to be an arduous process, and it will be kind of like a roller coaster. Well, there will be ups and downs, and it's not going to be from point A to point B. Mainly, primarily because the red lines that each side have negate the other side's must-haves. So you have Ukraine, or you have Russia that wants permanent Ukrainian neutrality. It wants Ukraine to guarantee it won't have European forces on its borders or inside of its borders. But then you want, the Ukrainians need to know that they won't be invaded again. And so I think this is going to make out for some pretty difficult negotiating positions, and we're going to have to grind this out for quite some time. I also don't think Trump really cares, if I'm being honest, like what comes out of these discussions. I think the deal for him is, the outcome is the deal. It's not what's within the deal. It's coming to an agreement, coming to some sort of arrangement. And so in that sense, he's not arguing for Ukraine to get the best position. He's arguing or negotiating for an end to this war. And I think there's a distinction between those things. Nevertheless, I think that there are a few positions that some are less likely than others. People talk about this West German model where Ukraine is invited to join NATO, but it's only the parts that Kiev controls that are under NATO's Article 5 agreements. I think we know that that's a red line for numerous reasons. There's a Norwegian model whereby Ukraine joins NATO, but says that no foreign forces will be stationed on its territory. I think this is another red line, mostly because of the NATO membership and not because Russia doesn't want it or says it's a red line. But I don't think that there's agreement amongst NATO's 32 members about whether or not Ukraine should be in or out of the alliance. And I think that's really where the crux of the matter lies in. But then you have a lot of discussions about this potential Israel model, where basically you turn Ukraine into a porcupine. And that just means you strengthen its armed forces enough, you strengthen its defense industrial base, you arm it to the teeth so that it's completely indigestible for a would-be adversary, in this case, Russia, that would potentially try to invade again. And so I think the end of these discussions will be somewhere in this sphere, although the outcome is, I think, yet to be determined. You know, there's this really interesting quote from the Czech writer Milan Kundera that says, "A small country is one which knows that it can disappear at any moment," and I think Ukraine knows this, and so we'll be arguing from that position, certainly.
Thank you. We're going to open up. We have about a little less than 20 minutes for questions. I'm going to take a few questions from the floor. If everyone could please keep it to a question, not a comment. And two, please identify yourself. I'll take a few from the floor. Perhaps the gentleman here. Please, if you could ask your question.
Sorry. Good afternoon. I am Colonel Vidur Sharma. I am currently a research fellow with the ORF. My question is to Mr. Paul Saunders and Mr. Nikonov, to you both. I'll say that if we look beyond the immediate issue, that is the Ukraine war or the end of Ukraine war, the biggest beneficiary of this old, the Britain-Russia rivalry, or subsequently converted into the USSR or now US-Russia rivalry, is the China. If you see during the Cold War, during the, I'll say, colonial period.
Yeah, if you could just keep it to a question, please.
Question is, okay. So my question is, can we see a Nixon movement? What the Nixon did in 1971 with China, a rapprochement between US and Russia, or maybe outlandish idea that Russia joining the NATO, and so that you can both focus on the real enemy, that is the China.
I think it's called a reverse Kissinger in some circles. And second question, please.
Yes,
Up here, the lady up here.
Yes, thank you very much. Good afternoon,
I'm sorry,
everyone. Sorry.
The
Yeah.
lady here in white.
Hello, I'm Mariam Lambert from Emile Foundation. I have a question. During this peace negotiation between US and Ukraine, one of the key points was the aspect of the people. So the children who are transferred, deported, illegally taken. I'm really weighting my words here because we need to be balanced. What is the opinion, the approach of the Russian Federation on that point? I'm very curious.
Are you directing the question at any particular panelist?
To Mikonov, to Mr. Mikonov.
Okay. One more, maybe from the back of the room.
Yeah.
I see a gentleman back there who had his hand up in the tie. Yes, he still has. If you could stand up, please. So, Mike. Yes.
Zbigniew Wysarski from Poland, from Pulaski Foundation. I have a question to Mr. Nikonov, who is grandson of Mr. Molotov. And the question is, aren't you concerned that legacy of Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact might be an issue in the current negotiations over the Ukraine? Thank you.
I have former Prime Minister of Australia, Tony Abbott.
Thank you. And this question is to the Russian panelists, and it's a pretty simple one. Does the Russian state accept that Ukraine has a right to exist as a free and independent country?
I think we had 4 questions, all 4 of them in part at least addressed to Mr. Nikonov. So maybe if you could take the first one, then I'll ask if any of the other panelists want to chime in on any of it. So Mr. Nikonov, if you'd like to address them.
Actually, the first question was to Mr. Saunders on the Chinese moment, Nixon moment, because, of course, the Center of National Interest was started by Richard Nixon. The answer, of course, is no. There is no Richard Nixon here, and Trump is not Nixon. And Russia is different, China is different, America is very different. There is no way any rapprochement, which is very hypothetical, between Russia and the United States can hurt the relationship between Russia and China. I know that many of Indian friends are very unhappy hearing that, but Russia-China relations are very strong, as Russia-India relations as well. And we are cooperating bilaterally. We are cooperating in BRICS and Shanghai Cooperation Organizations, multilaterally. And at a time when we are under more sanctions than the rest of the world in the whole history of humankind, and most of them introduced by Americans, of course, there is no comparison, since China is #1 trading partner of Russia. And India is rising high also as a trading partner of Russia. Our trade quadrupled in the last 3 years. So we are prepared to be friends with everyone who wants to be friends with us. As simple as that. It was always the case. Russia in NATO. Elon Musk recently made a great line. He wrote in his Twitter that Europeans like so much to be governed that they create a government to govern their governments. So Russia is not in that position. We are sovereign state. We're not interested in being governed by somebody, not at all. So 0 chance for that. Children at war. This is a big tragedy, of course. Children die. Actually, the Munich conference was mentioned, but at the Munich conference and the start of the special military operation, as we call it, there were 15 years. And 8 years out of these 15, there was shelling of Donetsk and Lugansk by Ukrainian army. And there were kids killed there. 10,000 people died. And actually that was not noticed. In Western media, mostly they say, oh, they shell it themselves. But there were people and children dying, and they continued dying. Of course, there were children moved to Russia from these areas. As for the rest, if there are separated families, we are definitely for reunification of families. And there is a lot of going on the line of 2 ombudsmen of the 2 countries. They're exchanging prisoners, and they're exchanging those who are looking for their families, for the reunification of families. And it works okay, even in the situation when quite a few Russians with kids, without kids, kids without families, were deported to Ukraine from Kursk Oblast, where they invaded in August. So we are definitely for the reunification of families. As for legacy of Molotov-Ribbentrop, first of all, Winston Churchill said that this pact was, on the one hand, coldly calculated, on the other hand, absolutely logical. And in my view, of course, that was the only way to prevent the war immediately at that time. And without the pact, we probably would not win the war. And we're going to celebrate 18th anniversary of victory in that war. The pact was about winning over Nazism. It was not a collaboration with Nazism. It was a tactical move, which ended up in Berlin in 1945, where Russian forces defeated 80% of German divisions. And we will be celebrating it on the 9th of May with our friends from all over the world, including India, by the way, China, and many other countries, which were fighting Nazism during World War II, unlike many countries of the European Union who were on the other side. You know, you can have different opinions of my grandfather, but read Churchill, read Roosevelt. They knew him somewhat better than probably you. And they said that he was one of the greatest diplomats on earth. Churchill said that probably Metternich, Talleyrand, Sully would be happy to have him in their company if there is a paradise or whatever where the Bolsheviks would let them go. The fifth question, does Ukraine has the right for independent existence? Yes, of course. Yes, of course. Actually, Ukraine is an independent state, is a creation of Russia. It was the Russian Federation which created Ukraine and provided independence to Ukraine. You may remember that Ukraine was a product of the collapse of the Soviet Union and of the agreement of President Yeltsin to let Ukraine go. And we had very good relations until some, forces decided that, read Brzezinski, Russia with Ukraine is a possibility of the revival of the empire. We should do our best to prevent that from happening. We should do whatever we can to take Ukraine away from Russia. They spent zillions. They were proud of spending zillions on NGOs in Ukraine, all these NGOs which are now being closed by President Trump. They just said that, 80% of Ukrainian media was sponsored by the United States, by USAID. That's what happened. And they managed to create Russians who would kill Russians for speaking Russian. And that's what happened. And Putin warned not once, not just in Munich, many, many times afterwards, in every speech he delivered, that Russia has security concerns. These are security concerns about expanding NATO, about bringing NATO forces close to the Russian border, which violates the Russia-NATO Founding Act. They were organizing already in military bases in Ukraine. Said, no, this is for us, this is the red line. This is, for us, it's existential. For us, it is like, Cuban Missile Crisis. For Americans, it was enough to threaten and to prepare nuclear attack on Russia because of they perceived it as their national security threat. Then Russians brought missiles to Cuba. For us, American missiles in Ukraine is no better than Russian missiles on Cuba for the United States. And I don't remember anyone objected to what Americans did then. They regarded it as their national security concern and a legitimate one. So we also have legitimate security concerns. And for us, this conflict is very serious, and we regard it as existential. And that means that Russia will go for peace, but not unconditional.
Paul Saunders, if I can turn to you, particularly that first question, which was partly addressed to you, and maybe if you have a quick intervention on something else, you're welcome to. I'm going to come to all the other panelists in a bit.
I'll try to be very brief. I think that the prospects for the United States to split apart somehow China and Russia are quite limited. The first reason for that is that we already did it once. And both of those countries saw and experienced that, and I don't think they want to allow that again. The second reason is that each of them has global ambitions, and they have a 4,000-kilometer border that neither of them would be able to pursue its global ambitions if their relationship tilted from something cooperative into something more tense. And I think that creates a pretty solid floor under that relationship. That said, Russia is moving into an economic and technological dependence on China that's likely to far exceed the dependence that it had on the West. If one goes back and reads closely President Putin's 2018 address to the Federal Assembly, there are a couple of good paragraphs in there where Mr. Putin describes quite vividly the consequences for Russia and for any other country that lags technologically behind others. So while I think this idea of splitting them apart is problematic, I do believe that it's possible to create more distance than there is now. And I think it's ultimately the Russian government that will have to make that choice.
I think we have time for one final question. A lady in the back there. If you could please keep it brief, and then.
Thank you. Dr. Shelest, Foreign Policy Council, Ukrainian Prism. I have a question to the US delegation. You've been speaking a lot about the reality on the ground. So what is reality on the ground? Ukrainian forces in Kursk, or Putin's statements that he would like to have not only what he already controlled military, but the full control over Zaporizhia and Kherson regions where his forces even never been, like the city of Zaporizhia, because he already included it into the Russian constitution. So are we making reality, or we are just accepting the aggressor who is lying, and Mr. Nikonov perfectly was not able to stay with the facts more than 40 minutes and then started to lie about Donetsk and other places?
We're going to do just a last round, maybe start with Rachel, and if anyone wants like a final comment, we have a few minutes. So.
Yeah, I'll zoom out a little bit and try to answer that as best as I can. I mean, look, I think what we have to understand here is that for Russia, this goes deeper than Ukraine. Russia wants to regain a sphere of influence that it believes that it has lost. And I think that calls in interesting questions to parts of Europe. It also calls into question what that means for middle powers like India. And then I would just say, as an American, I understand the follies of using military power as a tool to advance national interests. I mean, we tried this in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya. It all failed. It cost us trillions of dollars. Russia's effort on behalf of Bashar al-Assad in Syria also failed. If Russia succeeds in ensuring Ukraine remains outside of the West, then this outcome, I think, will normalize using military force to advance national interests, and I think that's a very dangerous line that we're abutting.
May I say a few words? I don't have a habit of lying, by the way.
Mr. Nikonov, we'll let you have a chance.
I just have to answer. I don't have a habit of lying. I'm well aware of facts. Sometimes
but your facts,
you
sir.
believe your own propaganda,
Your facts.
but that happens.
Paul, anything
If
you
I
want to
might
address?
just-
No, Sorry, we'll just let the panelists go. Paul Saunders?
My flat was destroyed by your drone 2 months ago
Sorry.
in the UNESCO protected downtown of the city.
If-
And the next
Sorry,
city
excuse
now
me.
can destroy.
Excuse me,
That
I
is
think-
the fact.
Excuse me, I think we'd like to
Can
hear
I
from
make-
the panelists, please.
Can I make a?
No, I think just Paul Saunders, if you just like anything to say on the last
I'll
question.
be very brief. I think we have a vivid illustration of how difficult it's going to be to address all of this.
Ambassador Mosbacher?
To my colleague's point about a military force, I don't think that that is the 21st century way to go. It's about economic force. It's about technological innovation. Russia doesn't manufacture anything that anyone wants to buy. They are not innovative. Consequently, the question is just how competitive you can stay. And maybe a regional power, but without the nuclear weapons, they have the GDP of Italy. And it's going to be growth in one's creating jobs. It's going to be being able to integrate technology. It's going to be resilience based on that and growing one's economies to make people prosperous, because we don't really, wars start with failed states. So the goal has to be to attract investment and grow, and that will be the defining factor as we go forward. And as the world wants to solve these problems, it won't be with bombs. It will be with economic prosperity.
The only shots we should have are of Smirnoff, right?
Well, as a final comment, I think that maybe the dangerous thing is to underestimate your counterparts, even within the statistics. But I just would like to express the hope that presidents that are going to talk tonight, and maybe again and again, will be able to go beyond the stereotypes that we discussed today. Otherwise, these negotiations won't end up successful in any case. Thank you.
Final word, anything? Is there anything you'd like to add? Final word? And I'll wrap up.
Well, I don't think there is a need for final word. I just would like to say that purchasing power parity-wise, Russia is the fourth largest economy and Italian is the 12th. So just to be precise. As for the discussion, I think it was good. The questions were predictable. I understand the feelings of our Ukrainian friends. They should understand our feelings as well. We also have casualties. War is a bad thing. No one likes the war. We definitely would like to move to peace. But now it's more difficult on the one hand because of so many casualties. And neither side would like to just say, oh, they died in vain, you know. They died for something. Both the Russians and Ukrainians were fighting for their land, for their future, for what they consider to be right. I hope that at some point Russia and Ukraine will come together, sit together, and also be at the negotiating table like Trump and Putin. It's not for Russia and America to decide the fate of the third countries. I think Russians and Ukrainians living together for so many centuries can solve their problems. I'm half Ukrainian. Both of my grandmothers were born in Ukraine. I don't think we have much to divide. I love Ukraine, and I think we'll be together sooner or later.
Well, on that note, it's time to wrap up. I'll just say a few things that I took away from this conversation while we all had our disagreements. There did seem to be some consensus that trust is going to be an issue on both sides, that a reverse Kissinger or reverse Nixon is out of the question, or very highly unlikely. and that things may change very rapidly in the next few hours after we hear the readout of the Trump-Putin call. With that, please join me in thanking the panelists. Thank you all for your attention. Bye.